Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited to have you on here. We've been going back and forth for a couple of weeks now about trying to find a time. So I'm really thankful that we could work it out. This is really cool. I'm happy you could do this.
Thank you for having me. This is my first time on Twitch. Hey, y'all.
Wow.
So I'm sorry about the lack of decoration in my Queen's Park office. I hate this place, so I haven't really invested much of personality into it. That's why it's beige.
That's okay. It's the new office, right?
It's the same office. They didn't evict me from it.
Oh, okay.
I'm surrounded by a bunch of my former colleagues.
Oh,
I am.
okay.
But it's
Yes.
the only accessible office in the whole of Queen's Park.
Okay. Well, how was it going back with this new session?
It wasn't as awkward as I thought it would be. I thought it would be much more awkward. I think it's been okay so far. I was able to table my 2 motions on reforming social assistance in Ontario. The hallway conversations weren't as bad as I thought they would be. So,
okay, good. Well, listen, Sarah, I want to talk about sort of the events of the last couple of weeks. I know you've been through a lot over the last little while, and I really want to get your perspective on that. I do have a number of viewers that tune into this program from America, from Europe, and different places around the world. So I was wondering, just to sort of set the stage here, do you want to just maybe introduce yourself and talk a little bit about how you got involved in politics and how you became an MPP, and then we can kind of get into what's been going on the last couple of weeks.
Sounds good. For those who don't know me, my name is Sarah Jama. I was elected in a by-election to serve Hamilton Centre in March of 2023, so almost a year ago, with the New Democratic Party. Prior to that, I was an organizer in Hamilton, Ontario, focused predominantly on issues of disability justice and anti-Black racism in my community. I started off as an organizer when I was president of the McMaster Womanists on my local campus, took on carding in my community and anti-police violence, and then moved into disability justice work. I started the first Disability Justice Network of Ontario, which was youth-led, and worked to basically teach disabled youth how to organize in our communities, because I felt that disabled youth were often left out of political spaces. We're taught to ask for help instead of create the worlds or demand the worlds that we want to see and that we believe we belong in. So teaching a lot of those organizing skills to youth. I also co-managed the successful campaign of the first woman of color in my city, Councillor Narinder Nan. So I think I've done a pretty okay job at being in community work, but also politically adjacent to Big P politics. And when Andrea Horvath, who was the leader of the NDP, stepped down from her Hamilton Centre seat to run for mayor, my friends and I signed up about 600 new members to the NDP within a couple weeks so that I could run for the nomination and take that seat. And I got elected shortly thereafter. That's who I am. Did you want me to continue and talk about?
No, that's great. That's a great way to set the stage. I guess I was wondering, even before we get into the last couple of weeks, as someone that's focused on, the disability justice and police violence, systemic racism, and these kinds of subjects, which I know are really important to a lot of people in Hamilton and around the country. How have you found, prior to these events, working within that system, within the NDP, do you think the NDP has been a good vehicle for being able to talk about these issues frankly and kind of suggesting reforms or having a critique? How has been your experience with working within the NDP to talk about this stuff up until October?
I think that's always been the question. Can you make change from within the system? We know that the system is broken. It's not fixable from the inside, but I think what I was interested in was experimenting to see if it's possible for organizers to genuinely be represented in political spaces In a Canadian sense, the Canadian system is it's very different from other systems, and the left-wing parties that we find ourselves interacting with in Canada are very different from parties that say they're left-wing across the world. I was hoping that there would be room to do things a little bit differently, stick to principle while also pushing for major change. I think to enter political spaces in general, you're asked to give up parts of yourself, to adhere to a sort of culture and decorum that is never explicitly stated. So I find that I have broken, even before the censure, I know we're going to get into it, but I have been told I broke so many rules of decorum that were never really written down. You have to bow at a certain time to a speaker, or you're not allowed to swear when you're speaking. Your press releases have to look a certain way. You're supposed to wear blazers. I think I'm one of the few people who don't during question period very often. You're just supposed to adhere to a certain way of speaking and operating immediately out the gate when you're elected here, and nobody really hands you a rule book. And then you get looked at sideways when you don't really operate that way. So I think there was a huge culture shock, just even outside of the NDP, like in general, as I was elected, because the things that people valued, like I won every poll in my riding, in the leader's riding, the leader of the party, and I'm someone with a very different politic from the former leader of the NDP, Andrew Horwath, who I replaced, and I still won every poll. Like I think folks were excited to volunteer, to donate, to get involved in my campaign. So to have that celebrated during the campaign period, but then to be elected and scolded or feeling this unspoken pressure to follow a culture that nobody was explaining directly or willing to change was very strange. And then with the NDP, I think that culture definitely does exist too. I think one of the things that I learned from talking with Jeremy Corbyn was that the UK Labour Party at least has mechanisms for dissent within the party structure, for caucus members to disagree with each other and have difficult conversations that are explicitly stated, and then an appeal process for when things go wrong or when people are kicked out. There's processes to follow. Everything in the political space in Ontario operates through unwritten rules, and I think the NDP operates that way too. There are a lot of rules in terms of how you should function as a member of the team that aren't explicitly stated, and there's nothing to fall on in terms of rules when there are disagreements. So I think things that would need to change are those sort of internal mechanisms that just don't exist, because it's kind of like operating as a fish out of water. That's how I felt after I got elected.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, I think there's a lot of people around this country, activists or whoever else, just any people that pay attention to this stuff, that is really looking for people to use their political platform to really speak unapologetically about certain issues, whether it's the police, racism, housing, or Israel-Palestine or anything like that. I mean, you mentioned Corbyn. I think he's a really interesting example. It was really kind of interesting for me to follow his rise from someone who is kind of an outlier in his own party to eventually leading the party, despite being kind of having a very different view of politics and a different view of foreign policy. And it was, I think, really fascinating for me and instructive to see the way that the sort of party establishment, even if he was the leader of the party, kind of unite against him and kind of tried to undermine him at every turn. So it shows how difficult it must be to, even when you rise to the leadership of some of these parties in a Western liberal democracy, to actually meaningfully steer it in a different direction. And you obviously got a little bit of a taste of that as well. You mentioned prior to October 7th and like some of the difficulties you were having. And then in the days following October 7th, you put out a statement that I think for me, and I think a lot of people around this country that pay attention to Israel-Palestine, saw as kind of a breath of fresh air, where it was a statement that, in my view, was grounded in like empathy And it was also took time to establish a kind of historical context, and it was a statement that didn't just mindlessly repeat the normal talking points we normally hear in these kind of moments about Israel's right to defend itself, which across the political spectrum we hear time and time again, over and over, no matter what Israel's actually doing. So I thought that was a really incredible thing. I think a lot of people around the country did, and the political establishment that you're a part of, even inside the NDP, didn't really view it in that way, I guess, would be a nice way of putting it. Do you just want to talk a little bit about what happened during that period, those few days, and how you came out with that statement and your experiences afterwards?
Yeah, for sure. Before I even get into that, I think it's important to say, like, even during my campaign, a lot of the right-wing media came after me relentlessly. Like, there were articles written day after day after day because of my support of solidarity for Palestinian human rights on my campus. Like, I supported the BDS movement on my campus getting passed. So during the campaign, even, that was a huge topic, my support for Palestine. And before I even put my name in the ring, like, these are issues that I've taken a stance on before, and everyone was aware of my stance across the political spectrum. So it wasn't a surprise. I think that's important to note. It's not like I randomly decided to weigh in. Like,
yeah.
I've been following this issue for some time, and everyone around me knew my stances on this issue. So when October 7th happened, I stayed quiet for 3 days. The leader of my party and many political voices across Canada weighed in, either in condemnation of Hamas or saying that Israel had the right to defend itself. By day 3, the Rafah border closed. White phosphorus was being used, which is a chemical banned by the United Nations. And food and water were being stopped at the border. So from that, you could already tell the genocidal intent that the state of Israel had, because of the pace that these things were happening. And I was very alarmed at the speed at which everyone who had some sort of political power was talking about Israel's right to defend itself, but nobody was trying to contextualize, other than Palestinians themselves. No one in the political class had been talking about the right for Palestinians to exist and be safe, and what was about to happen. And so by day 3, I was like contacting NDP staff. I was like, hey, like, this is not going to end up. This is going to be terrible. I'm getting emails from people in my riding who have family under the rubble right now. I actually took the time to read a very lengthy email to one of the staff, and I was like, I have to say something. These are stances I've taken before. Like, I don't know if I can be here in this space if I'm not going to be able to say something, because it's important. And not only are people expecting it, like, I expect it. What right do I have to be in these spaces if I'm not going to use them to say something meaningful? The only power that I have as like an elected official is when I choose to weigh in using my voice on different issues. So we had a bit of a back and forth. Common messaging that I would hear often in general from the NDP is like, we have to think about 2026. We have to think about the end project, the end goal. The key messages should be around the Greenbelt scandal and Ford, and these are the things that people care about. Anything outside of that calculation politically is seen as taking away from a main message that appeals to the main voters. And so it became very apparent to me that it would be a situation of like, either say nothing and wait for the right amount of people to die before I say something, or just, do the right thing. And I didn't anticipate getting the censure debate, which was 8 hours long, likening me to terrorists or terrorist sympathizers. I didn't anticipate getting kicked out of my caucus, which happened right before the censure vote. I didn't anticipate my right to speak in my role as an MPP being taken away. I didn't anticipate any of it, but what I was calculating at that time was my I think the mistake that progressives who are elected tend to often make is the idea that political calculus is more important than morality in these moments.
Yeah.
And I think that's a mistake because people can see through the performative bullshit that we put out in these rules. Like, the planet is burning, people are dying, and truthfully, there was already an incident prior to this one where I had to unretweet a thing I retweeted about a Palestinian prisoner who died after being detained for 10 years. I retweeted a Palestinian scholar, Nora, who was talking about the detained prisoner who died, and I had to unretweet it, and then I was condemned in my local paper for a retweet. By that point, I was already tired of being made to play some sort of weird political calculus about people's lives. So that was my last straw. And I just think it's a mistake that we have to pretend to adhere to these invisible rules that don't exist. We can do things differently, and we should be able to value the voices of people who would feel politically at home in a party system that was representing them in a holistic way, that wasn't just about tight message boxes, that wasn't just about random polls that tell you how many votes you're going to get if you take a stand on a certain issue or not. We need to be able to calculate morality and into this. And I'll also say, Sven Robinson in early 2000s, he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the NDP federally, and he literally went to Palestine and squared up with an IDF soldier. Literally squared up with one.
Yeah, there used to be space to take this kind of position.
Yeah, it was on international news, and he didn't lose his critic portfolio. He was just made to be the foreign affairs critic for the NDP federally, except for the Middle East. But me saying something, I was framed as making people unsafe. I was framed as being difficult to work with. I was all of these tropes that came out of nowhere in general, not just from the NDP, but from everywhere. All the while receiving more death threats than I've ever received in my entire life, and rape threats and a whole bunch of other things. And I had to actually go into hiding. So I think some of the way I was treated was to be made an example of, especially in the censure process. And I guess I'm just here to say, I think more people should still try to run, as independent or not, whatever you want to do. But I'm here still in my MPP seat because I refuse to be pushed out. I refuse to be made to feel that my riding, Hamilton Centre, which is the poorest riding in all of Ontario, let me say, legitimately, I refuse to say that my riding and people in my riding don't deserve a voice, and that my riding doesn't care about Palestine, because that's not true. People do care, and we deserve to exist in these spaces as folks who have good politics, right? And so, I refuse to be pushed out. Sorry for ranting, but that's mostly what
that's
I have
okay.
to say.
And there's been a lot going on. No, I think I said something to the same effect around that time, which is that it's one thing to say you stand with Palestinians when it's easy to do, when it's just kind of this perfect victimhood that you can kind of talk about. It's a lot more difficult in moments like that, and I think that's the time when you have to do it the most, is when it's difficult. And that was a really difficult time to make that statement, and I think it was really an incredible thing that you did do that.
And completely friggin' it's I feel so terrible because it's also at the same time political performative BS. Like the media just spent so much energy and time talking to me instead of Palestinians. And yeah, I did what I could to center what was going on. But even today, in today's day and age, like the same thing is still happening. Folks are being killed in Rafah right now after being told to head there for safety. And there's nothing we can do. Like it I say all that to say, like, as much as I'm being applauded by folks on the left for doing what I did, what I said was also the bare minimum.
Yeah.
The bare minimum, the safest thing I felt like I could say. We actually, like, my team and I put that up and we were like, oh, nobody's going to get mad because we quoted the United Nations. Like, and obviously I was wrong.
Well, the United Nations is Hamas now, actually, so unfortunately.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
But, like, yeah, so I say all that to say, like, I also feel hopeless, just like everybody else probably watching this and unsure of what to do. And the important thing is to, yeah, cool, I put up a statement, but the important thing is to keep talking about it, keep going to the protests, keep emailing your MPs, do everything and anything that you can to pressure the federal government to do more than they're doing now and to stop selling arms to Israel. I think that's what we can do and disrupt where you can.
Yeah, and I guess it's just frustrating because we have a lot of conversation in this country. If you're on the left, you got the NDP is basically just the de facto representation for all these kind of movements for social justice or climate justice or Palestine. It's like it's the only vehicle on a federal level that can really speak to these issues. So it's been a consistent source of frustration, I think, when there's this reticence on the part of the NDP to really go all the way and sort of talking about these things. I know there's been some improvement, I think, over the Palestine issue in particular. I know there's been a lot of like convention fights over resolutions to try and talk about this more and advocate for a bit more of a serious position. And I know that's positive. But it's frustrating, I think, and I imagine it's really frustrating for you that, like, especially when you're under that level of scrutiny from the conservatives and the liberals and the media establishment attacking you like that your party just wouldn't take your side in that moment, even though now most people in the party have come along to this position that, oh yeah, we need to advocate for a ceasefire, and they're saying a lot of the similar things that you said immediately. But you know, now it's like you said, now it's kind of safe now that we can see the level of violence and horror that we all knew was coming. And meanwhile, you find yourself censured and not part of the caucus. Like, it just seems kind of a really backwards way of approaching this kind of issue and talking about this stuff.
Yeah, I think it goes back to this weird political calculus that I don't know how, obviously I wasn't in on the math. I don't know how people are deciding what they decide, but yeah, I think it just is, right? And I think in terms of the censure, I'm still fighting that, so hopefully that'll get repealed. I've left the door open for conversations really with anyone who's willing to collaborate on the motions I'm putting forward. I think the censure was created so that I think the hope from the conservatives was that people like me would just disappear or learn our lesson that we don't belong here. But that's not happening. I'm still going to work with community to table community drafted motions, and anyone who's willing to move them can move them. I hope that the NDP will change. I think the direction of the federal party has been nice to see, and I don't know. I don't know what to say. I'm an independent. I'm gonna continue to do what I'm doing, and like I hope people come around to before 2026, like especially changing how they operate internally and externally. I think there's a lot at stake. Like as much as the NDP frustrates me, I'm tenfold more frustrated at the Ford government in terms of what he's doing to our healthcare system and our education system. He's literally privatizing it. Like people are going to die if they haven't already because they cannot afford to see a doctor. And we're living in a scary time, and I worry about what it means for him to serve another 4 years as premier. and the amount of people that will die because of his harmful legislation. Uh, so I hold that too. Again, the whole system is broken, and I'm unsure of where best folks should put energy. I think it would be encouraging to see lots of folks run as independent. I think it would be encouraging to see the NDP, especially provincially, change course and create dynamics that would allow for new voices, fresh voices, younger voices to actually belong in caucus, instead of adhering to these century-old cultural rules of how politics should operate. Like, how do we adjust things so that we can operate differently? So yeah, I think both options are what I would like to see. Either more folks running as independents, or the NDP actually changing course internally to restructure to allow for progressive, strong voices to exist without being pushed out. And on top of all that, fighting the censure, because I think that will set a precedent. It sets a bad precedent that the majority government can just decide to use a censure process. Censures are usually there to police the behavior of MPPs who are, like, their conduct in the House. I put up an Instagram statement and a Twitter statement that had nothing to do with my behavior at Queen's Park. So for a majority government to just decide, because every other party voted against the censure, it was the Conservatives voting on their own thing that decided to take away the voice of somebody who was elected. That's borderline fascism, coming from folks who tout free speech rhetoric all of the time, right? Yes. So that in and of itself is a dangerous snowballing effect. And
yeah, sometimes I'm not so sure these people care about free speech the way that they claim to. Can you talk a little bit about, like, the censor and how that's affected your ability to do your job, like, specifically?
I mean, I can't do as much of the performative stuff. I can still vote on key issues that impact my riding. I can still speak in committee, which is where committee work is where the bulk of the work actually happens. You go through bills line by line. And I can still vote in committee. I can still table motions. I just can't debate them. But most of the time, because we're in a majority conservative government, the Conservatives just vote down anything to do with, like, anything that's not coming from themselves. And so when we're debating motions that we move, traditionally you're debating against empty chairs because they're not sitting at their desks anyway. So it's just performative. It's just for the camera clips. And then you can post online and say, I did this thing, I debated this thing that's going to get voted down. So I can't do that performative part of the job, but I can work with others to get them to move motions that I think are important to my riding if I want to. I can still table motions and put forward good ideas. So we saw that earlier in the week when I proposed social assistance reform ideas in collaboration with the ODSP Action Coalition in my community. I can do that kind of stuff, and I can still do a bulk of the job. In terms of locally in Hamilton Center, most MPPs, when they're at Queen's Park, kind of like negate their local community and their riding. So far, since we've opened our office, we've served 4,000 constituents, and we have a really active, newly formed independent riding association, which is not common in Canada. I don't think there's many independent riding associations that are active, but we have 60 members already, and we quietly raised about $35,000 without really much of a fundraising ask. So I'm still going out on the doors, canvassing and door knocking with my riding association, which also isn't common in between elections. And instead of asking for people's votes, I'm saying, hey, I've been elected for almost a year now. What are your thoughts? What are your key issues? And updating people on the work that I'm doing, rather than just only sitting at my desk in a performative way. So I still think I can do a bulk of the job, and the pieces that the censure impacts is just the debate piece, which is mostly useless, if I'm being quite honest.
Yeah, well, still, it would be good to eventually get that removed, obviously. And I know there's going to be a lot of people around the country that are going to be really interested to see how being an independent, works in practice. Mm-hmm. Like I said, it's like if you're on the left, you end up talking a lot about the NDP and criticizing the NDP because you know that the conservatives are not on your side and they're worse, and you know the liberals are not on your side in a lot of these issues. But it's hard not to look at, from my perspective anyways. I'm not trying to get you in trouble. From my perspective, though, it's hard not to look at the last 6, 7, 8 years and all the issues that are causing so much concern for so many people. There was the Trump era in the United States and the kind of growing threat of sort of right-wing extremism. There's the climate crisis, our housing situation in this country, COVID, and it just feels like it's been a huge missed opportunity for people in the NDP to really present a more unapologetic vision for how they could offer up something different than what our mainstream establishment is really doing. And we haven't, or Indigenous rights, again, is another example of this is something that we should be taking more forceful issues on and stances on. And it just seems like there's been a failure to do that. And I think the fact that the needle hasn't really moved for the NDP federally anyway over the last during that time frame, I think it's hard not to look at that with a lot of disappointment, because there's a lot of issues that people are really passionate about that aren't really being meaningfully addressed by our ruling class, and there's not enough of an alternative being proposed. I did want to, so you mentioned something about, the way that you became the focus of this sort of media cycle. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I noticed this often when it comes to like these sort of issues, but especially over the last 4 months, I've noticed this huge discrepancy between what our media is talking about and these little cycles of sort of faux outrage that take place. What our media is talking about, what our political figures are talking about, versus the horrific violence that we're seeing unfolding every single day.
You're talking about the Spider-Man thing?
I'm going to mention that. Yeah, I'm talking. There's your statement. There has been the protest at Indigo. There was the protest outside of Selena Robinson's office in BC. There was protest at Melanie Jolie's residence a few weeks ago. And yeah, there was this protest a week or two ago that passed by Mount Sinai Hospital and saw someone dressed as Spider-Man go on top of the awning and wave a flag. And these incidents, like all these separate incidents, caused this big outcry, and our media talks about it, and our political class weighs in on it, and everyone's kind of hand-wringing and denouncing these things while we're seeing just unimaginable violence unfolding every single day. I don't know about you, but just my phone has just been a constant stream of the most horrific things that I can imagine over the last 4 months. And our government is just fully supporting this, fully subsidizing it. And it makes me feel crazy after a certain point to look at what our media is talking about and these things that we're claiming to be outraged about versus what we're ultimately supporting in Israel-Palestine right now. So I guess this is an issue for me, though. Again, to bring it back to a critique of the NDP, I've seen a couple times now that prominent members of the NDP in these moments, I think, for whatever reason that I don't understand, kind of legitimize what I view as being really bad faith discourse and bad faith kind of outrage. And they throw gasoline on these things and say, "Oh, that's unacceptable. Like, obviously we need to protest, but we can't be doing that. We have to apologize for that. We've got to talk about this terrible incident with Spider-Man at Mount Sinai Hospital." And it's just very frustrating to see this over and over again.
Yeah,
do you think there needs to be room in the NDP or like in our country, in our discourse, not just to talk frankly and honestly about Palestine or any of these other issues, but to call out this kind of bad faith discourse and outrage and push back against these kind of these news cycles where we start talking about this kind of thing?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from kind of that like made up culture that I was talking about earlier. I think a lot of the politicians who weigh in and pro-clutch are like, "Oh no, like they're protesting someone's office or someone's house." Like, as someone who's like allegedly dropped a coffin in front of the mayor's house one time, and I was really upset with a few friends. Like, sometimes the only avenue we have as activists is to take up the streets or to like show up and say, we're really upset that you've removed yourself from this conversation and you're hiding in your house, or you're just, I think the pearl clutching comes from this innate sense of like self self-preservation that a lot of politicians have, to be like, oh no, I inherently am unsafe, which is fair. Like, some people have gotten like real threats or been in real dangerous situations by people who don't have their head on straight. But for the most part, like, this innate pearl clutching to like protect themselves is framed at odds from like people feeling unsafe, because literally entire police forces across Canada have said, you know, we're going to protect the public from Palestinian protesters. Like, it's the Palestinian organizers who are unsafe, right? Every time they take the streets or participate in an action. So I think it comes from not understanding how organizing works and like who actually is at risk when these things happen, or when these actions are planned. And it comes from trying to also distract from the main issue of what's actually going on. If like people in power can frame themselves as like the victim or being unsafe, it takes attention away from the people who are being literally massacred and killed and starved to death in Palestine. So I definitely think it's intentional, but it also is like coming from an innate weird place of white fragility often, and the need to center your own safety when it's usually not really at risk. I do think it's okay to protest in the ways that you can. Most of the time, organizers that protest, like if the problem is most politicians who are being protested are not okay with having public conversations. Like, if you came out of your office and you had a conversation, or you came out of your house to have a real conversation about the issue and you showed that you were listening to folks on the ground, I'm sure that would be fine. Like, people are just wanting answers, and because you've been absent, people have chosen to pull up to where you are. Like, I'm rambling, but yeah, I think a lot of this pearl clutching comes from this weird culture of like, oh no, we're gonna center ourselves because we're elected. It really is not that deep. And the Spider-Man thing was ridiculous as well, and that was a pure distraction.
Yeah, and once again, you were roped into that as well. You saw conservative media trying. And of course, Sarah Jama was present at this dangerous protest and framing it like that. Like, it's really outrageous the way our media has kind of conducted themselves throughout the last 3 months, and I imagine it's been frustrating to be a part of that.
I definitely agree. I think I was definitely used as a tool to distract the public in some sort of way by right-wing media, and I was upset about it too. I still think it was important to say something, so I'm glad I did, but it definitely was blown out of proportion. You had like media randomly saying that me going to a protest was celebratory. Strange. And then Justin Trudeau weighed in about Mount Sinai Hospital without weighing in on the attacks on hospitals in Gaza. Very strange times that we're living in.
Yeah, no, it's been incredibly bizarre, actually, to try and pay attention to it. So after all this time, and just the one thing I wanted to say as well, when you are involved in these protests and people say it's like celebratory or whatever, I would just like to point as well, and this goes out with your statement, is that anyone that knows anything about Israel and Palestine knew full well what was going to be happening after October 7th. And like you pointed out, by October 10th, if it wasn't clear on October 8th, it was certainly clear then exactly where this was going. And that's exactly why there were protests on almost day one, because people knew full well exactly what was going to happen. And all the folks that were making these kinds of statements and attending these protests because they knew the violence that was about to be unleashed in Gaza have been proven 100% correct. And all the people that were pearl clutching about it are maybe now coming around to this idea that, like, oh, maybe there should be some kind of ceasefire months later after tens of thousands of people have been killed, tens of thousands of children. So I think that's important to point out as well. And like on that subject, like, do you think Canada, because now you have Justin Trudeau, they just put out this statement with Australia and New Zealand and are kind of coming around to this idea of actually using the ceasefire language. We've seen Trudeau a number of times kind of stumble over this. Do you think that's too little too late? Like, is that something that you welcome?
It's too fucking late for a ceasefire. Like, these people have their heads in fully into their asses to think now that that's a useful thing to be saying when he had the opportunity to do something meaningful before 30,000 people were killed, and now there's no end in sight. Uh, I, sorry, I'm really mad because what is the point in this?
Yeah,
Like,
everyone.
again,
We
it
all
just
are.
feels like political theater. He hasn't fully committed to stopping the sale of arms, unless I'm mistaken, to Israel. So how much money is he funneled into killing Palestinians?
Well, I'm going to tell you.
How
Actually,
much of our
I have that
tax
information right
dollars?
in front of me.
Okay, great.
Because that's one thing that I found really also extremely frustrating about the last couple of months is you see like liberal administrations, like the Trudeau government and like the Joe Biden administration as well, fully support Israel's criminality and violence over the last 4 months, but also doing so while taking this kind of tone of, oh, we're so concerned about this, and talking about humanitarian aid and trying to talk like they care about the violence that's being unleashed while also fully supporting this violence. Like we can talk all like with the billions of dollars that America sends Israel, but the Trudeau government, according to this piece by Alex Kosh in The Maple, authorized since October $28.5 million of new military exports to Israel. So you have Trudeau, you have Melanie Joly or Chrystia Freeland or whatever trying to talk with some kind of empathy or talking about how concerned they are about whatever horrific incident that we've seen that day. And meanwhile, they've been funding this thing from the beginning and have been fully supporting it.
They're only saying anything now because of all the political pressure. I do not think they care. Or if they did care about the loss of human life, they would have waited earlier. They are only speaking now because of the political pressure that the Palestinian youth movement and other folks on the ground have been relentlessly putting into this work for months, if not years, but months since October 7th. They do not care. They have blood on their hands. If they're not held accountable in this life, I hope that they're held accountable in the next one. I blame Egypt too. There's a lot of anger to be had over what's going on, and I really hope the most we could do is just commit to not forgetting the role that Canada played in these atrocities now and later, regardless of the outcome.
Yeah, and this is something that I wanted to get to as well, which is that, like, does it feel for you? I mean, it certainly feels like this way for me. But does it feel for you that like something has been lost with Canada's image, whether domestically or internationally, about the whole idea of like Western values? Canada loves to lecture other countries around the world about human rights and how much we care about protecting people and stopping violence and women's rights and LGBTQIA plus rights and all these things, or freedom of the press. And meanwhile, everyone around the world can see what we're supporting right now, the brutal violence against civilians, women and children, Israel openly assassinating journalists, doctors, occupying hospitals, just the most horrendous things we can possibly imagine. Do you think Canada in particular is going to be able to ever kind of restore whatever semblance of an image that we might have had on some international stage as being somewhat progressive or supportive of these ideals? Do you think that's gone forever now? Because it feels like to me, for a lot of people in this country and around the world, it's been fully exposed. This whole idea of either Canadian values or Western values is being exposed as just a total farce, total lie.
The myth of Canadian exceptionalism is long, long gone. And it has been for some time. For those of us who are aware of colonialism here and the impact that the state of Canada has had on Indigenous people here, that's not removed from our failure to stand as a country against what is going on to the treatment of Palestinian people and the genocide in the state of Palestine. So for me, it's been dead for some time, but I think in general, I can't see anything that Canada can do to rehabilitate its image. And it comes back to that question of we need to start electing politicians that don't just play a game of political calculus, because everyday people are seeing it. The voter turnout keeps declining. People are losing faith in this political system as it is already. And we need to start electing folks who actually give a shit about morals. Otherwise, what is the point? And I think there's nothing that Justin Trudeau can do to rehabilitate his image in my eyes or the eyes of the public. And again, I hope he's held accountable for his decisions in this life and the next.
Yeah. And, just just to close this off, I don't want to be too much of a doomsayer about this, but it really does look like we're on the verge of what could be like a real, like, conservative sort of reactionary wave in the next federal election that's been building, kind of bubbling under the surface for some time. I don't really understand why some of these, like, Canadian reactionaries seem to have coalesced around Pierre Poilievre of all people, but hey, that's not really my place to question that, I guess. But I guess that's the thing, is like, if that does happen, I'm hoping that it does not, but if we do get overcome with this kind of like conservative populist wave, there's going to be a lot of people, progressive minded people around this country, that are going to be looking around, wondering what happened, and looking for someone that can actually give some answers or some real solutions to get out, to pull us away from the direction that we're going in. And I feel like that's not really going to happen as long as we have our only sort of like nominally left-wing party is kind of hampered by this inability to say what needs to be said, and to really like call these things out and take unapologetic radical stances about some of these real crises that we're facing. So that's why I'm thankful for the work that you're doing. I hope more people around the country are starting to pay attention to this and are tired of people playing these kind of games in these moments, whether it comes to foreign policy or domestic policy, housing or Indigenous justice or law and order or racism, whatever it is. I know there's people around the country that are tired of it, and I'm hoping that more folks around the country start to get the message that there will be people out there that will support you if you take these stances, if you don't play by these kind of phony rules. So that's why I'm thankful for you, Sarah, for the work that you're doing. Thank you for coming on the show to talk about your side of the story of everything that's been going on for the last few months. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone on Twitch also.
Yeah, they've been all very normal and respectful, all the weirdos on there. Do you just want to let folks know where they can contact you or find more information about what you're up to?
Sure. So you can go to my website, www.sarahjama.ca. Also, you can shoot me an email. We're pretty responsive. The email address is on my website as well. Reach out anytime. If you are ever in my neck of the woods, want to come out for a canvas, or even donate to support our riding association if you live in Ontario, we can use the support. We're going to be... our resources would be good. So if you have the time and the energy and the willingness to put in some effort out here, come reach out to us.
Fantastic.